Introduction. Lightning Protection. Nv Xiang, Fan Attribute, recommended stock buying. Overall relaxed, making up for regrets. The female lead is a time traveler, only remembering the general plot. The female protagonist will be reborn multiple times and appear in different eras. There is a system, but it's the same as not having one. No career, many emotional connections. Chapter 1. First Encounter. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Warm Mind Clearance. The female frequency BG has a female lead with a fan attribute, a single arrow, multiple creations, and a limited career line. The cover is the image of the female lead. The first meeting was on the edge of a less important battlefield. Sleepy fingers gently caressed her cheeks, taking away the dark red water droplets floating. The blue blood vessels float under the delicate skin, and the pale and weak neck is calmly exposed to the air. This kind of image freezes in Uchiha's mind. No matter how you look at Uchiha, he is not a qualified ninja. This is his first impression of her. A chaotic sound came from behind, and Uchiha, who had been hit hard by the knot, finally regained consciousness. Her pure black eyes turned around, facing Uchiha's beautiful eyes. Okay, she deserves to be distracted and bumped into on the battlefield. Hurry up. Uchiha gasped a few times and stood firmly on his sleeping arm. He lowered his head and glanced at the thousand-handed ninja lying on the side, feeling surprised for a moment. He heard the constant footsteps coming from behind and then took a few more difficult steps forward, trying to pull away the seemingly weak member of his clan. Uchiha looked at the several thousand-handed ninjas following behind and started moving as if he had finally reacted. It's okay if the enemy comes each time, it would be too troublesome to deal with so many. The young clan leader is indeed very capable of attracting firepower. After estimating the amount of movement required to escape and engage, Mion decisively chose to retreat. Her fingers bent forward slightly, grabbing Uchiha's wrist. Without waiting for a response, she turned her head and used the instant technique to run towards the depths of the forest. There is a pungent and bloody smell in the air, originating from Uchiha. He suffered considerable injuries in the battle just now, and many wounds are now bleeding. Uchiha looked at the black hair of the girl in front of her floating backwards due to running, and then glanced at the fan emblem behind her. He could only grit his teeth and follow the person for a moment. However, waves of pain came from the wound, causing Uchiha to struggle and his steps to be chaotic. It can almost be described as being dragged away. When the sleep stopped, the 2,000 armed ninjas who were not familiar with the nearby terrain were already left far behind, and the surroundings were also very quiet. Ah, finally got rid of it. The girl's voice rang in Uchiha's ear. He gasped for breath and lifted his head slightly, looking straight at the person in front of him. Black long hair and eyes of the same color, as well as a navy blue Uchiha ethnic costume. Everything reflects her identity as a member of the same clan. This is a very beautiful Uchiha, even impressive. She doesn't look very old, maybe she hasn't participated in 2 dangerous battles, so she didn't notice it before. Uchiha thought with uncertainty. Uchiha didn't pay attention to Banyan's probing gaze. She circled around for half a day, found a decent place, and pushed Uchiha aside to sit down. Hello, are you okay? Uchiha leaned against the sturdy broken tree, his expression mixed with some confusion. It was only then that he noticed that Uchiha's face was a bit pale, and she was also panting slightly under the intense exercise just now. If it weren't for her being completely clean, Uchiha would have thought she had also been injured. I'm pretty good, Uchiha shook his palm, feeling a sticky sensation in his palm. That's the blood I got from pulling Yuji's wave just now. It's such a disgusting feeling. She furrowed her brow and shook her hand with some discomfort. She looked around for a moment before finally squatting on the side. There is a very thin stream there. She reached into the water with her hand, while her other hand kept twisting away the bloodstains on her skin. These marks on fair skin are very eye-catching, some of which are already a bit dry and require some force to remove. After cleaning up, she breathed a sigh of relief and stood up satisfied, shaking off the water stains on her hands. I calmed down before thinking of the person I just pulled over. It seems to be injured, isn't it mild? So Mion turned her head and glanced at Uchiha. He was closing his eyes and making low gasps. Most of the visible wounds had already solidified, but the terrifying bloodstains and averted flesh were still stuck on him, enough to show that he had just experienced a fierce battle. This is Uchiha, I've only seen it from a distance.宇智波眠lowered his gaze for a while before turning around to find what the treatment needed. Compared to the image in my impression, I am still completely a teenager now. Reaching out to pull out the plants on the ground, Mion was a bit distracted in thinking. I feel a lot of pain on my body, and Uchiha is almost unable to think. Although it's embarrassing, he is really ugly enough to be injured like this now. His strength is far from sufficient. Not enough to support Uchiha yet. But now, what he needs is treatment. Thinking about this, Uchiha opened his eyes. He wanted to ask the strange tribe member to take him back to his homeland, but when he looked around, he found that there was no one nearby. She left. He frowned and thought uncertain. Never mind, even one person has to rush back. Quan Na is still waiting for him to go home.宇智波眠struggled to move his upper body forward, holding onto the ground and gritting his teeth to stand up. But suddenly someone pressed down on the shoulder. Where are you going? Is宇智波眠. She was holding a handful of wildflowers in her hand, her pale knuckles resting on Uchiha's shoulder. I thought you had left. Uchiha could only sit back with her strength. He looked at the plant strangely and hesitated for a few seconds before saying, I need to go back for treatment. Just here, you don't need to go back.宇智波眠also looked at him strangely and asked, do you really want to go home? She was a bit puzzled. At this moment, going out. Is it difficult for this guy to want to go out and continue being chased? Forget it, help him save his life first.宇智波眠lowered his eyes and reached out to explore the area where宇智波眠was injured. Her knuckles were cool and itchy when pressed against the wound.宇智波眠pursed his lips and swallowed the words. This guy may be skilled in medical ninjutsu. He thought with uncertainty. He is now weak and has no choice but to watch as宇智波眠fingers press against the wound on his abdomen.宇智波眠guessed half right.宇智波眠can indeed treat.宇智波眠fingers were firmly pressed against宇智波眠wound. Before宇智波眠could let out a painful cry, the terrifying flesh and blood slowly grew back, with some itching. The skin slowly enveloped the flesh and blood again until the wound was invisible.宇智波眠looked somewhat surprised at the area that was still flesh and blood blurred a few minutes ago, where the new skin was still slightly whitening, but he could no longer see the terrifying appearance before.宇智波眠calmly withdrew his hand.宇智波眠raised his eyes and saw that most of the wild flowers she was holding in her other hand had withered. Oh, this is Zaijinjukai.宇智波眠followed his gaze and glanced at the only remaining plant. The white flowers were withering on the branches, as if they would wither in the next moment. There are quite a few around here. She casually placed the withered branch in her hand on the soil, leaving behind this withered wild flower alone. Promoting blood circulation, relieving pain, clearing heat and detoxifying. After opening her mouth and reporting a few effects, she slowly added another sentence. Huayu is a longing filled with tears. She murmured incessantly and inserted this flower into Uchiha's hair. Her fingers inserted slightly between his hair, firmly pinning this small wildflower onto his head. She looked serious, as if she was completing an important task.宇智波眠squinted his eyes, and the radiance of the sunset shone through宇智波眠hair. His fingers, which were close at hand, emitted a fragrance of some kind of plant.宇智波眠did not stop. She stood up straight and glanced at the glow of the sunset. After dark, I'll take you back. She turned around and glanced at Uchiha, who was still sitting on the ground. She pulled out a piece of bandage from somewhere and wrapped it around his neck while he was still in a daze. Where did you come from? Ban squinted his eyes with some pain, as if he didn't see any place on Uchiha-Bomian's body where bandages could be stored. Oh, I knocked down 1,000 hands just now and felt it from him, Uchiha-Bomian replied casually, wrapping a bandage up and down all over the blood-stained area of Uchiha-Bomian's spot. Ding! Uchiha-Boban frowned, and before asking a question, he saw Mian turn around and slightly block her from the side. She had an extra short knife in her hand. Banjuan turned his eyes and lay on the ground with a handful of suffering. Enemy attack. Mian spat out 2 words towards Ban. Sure enough, after a few breaths, only one ninja with 1,000 hands jumped out of the bushes, and the person rushed towards the 2 of them quickly. Shui done, explosive water rush. The 1,000-handed ninja didn't say much. He quickly made a few marks and launched an attack in the direction of Mian and Ban. Fire escape. The art of Haohuobu. Mian placed her finger next to her lips and blew out a huge fireball to welcome the opponent's ninjutsu. After colliding in the air, the 2 exploded, forming a large mist that instantly blocked the view. In the fog, Uchiha-Boban saw Mian put out the same seal as the 1,000-hand ninja just now. Water escape, bursting water and rushing waves. Her calm voice rang in Ban's ear, and a larger spray of water poured out than the previous water escape, hitting the ninja with 1,000 hands straight and throwing them away, hitting the tree trunk from a distance. It almost ended in an instant. The sound of his body colliding with hard objects and tree trunks shattering echoed into Ban's ears, and he fixed his gaze on the back of Uchiha-Bomian. What are you doing looking at me like this? Uchiha-Bomian noticed his gaze and turned to look at him. The crimson ergo-you moved slowly in her pitch-black eyes. It's nothing, I'm just wondering if you need to go get a knife repaired. Uchiha-Boban shifted his gaze to the 1,000-handed ninja lying beside the tree in the distance. He looks as if he hasn't died yet. It's time to go back now. But Uchiha-Bomian just said slowly before reaching out his hand to him. Chapter 2. Familiarity. You are listening at novelfull.audio. When Uchiha saw her for the second time, it had been some time since the first meeting. Uchiha-Bomian crouched on the grass with her back to him, only to find her talking to a few wild flowers on the same ground when he approached. She chattered on and on about syllables that Uchiha-Boban couldn't understand, and her weak back even vaguely showed some protruding spines. Uchiha-Boban stood not far or near with his eyes down, watching her curled hair blown by the wind, pursing his lips without making a sound. Brother, what are you doing standing here? Uchiha-Bo-Chuanai walked over from the path behind him and poked his head out to take a look at Uchiha-Bo-Mian, who was still squatting over there. Don't you want to thank someone? Wait a moment. Uchiha-Bo-Chuanai blinked and reached out his finger to sleep. With a hint of inexplicable surprise, he asked again, is that person you're talking about? Referring to her. Uchiha nodded in confusion. I am puzzled by Quan Na's attitude. Uchiha-Bomian tilted his head when he heard the sound, slowly stood up and patted his arm when he saw the person, then turned around and looked straight at them. Young chieftain, Chuanai. Her face did not feel awkward being caught doing strange things, only a calm and somewhat strange sense of maturity. Is there anything else? The implication is that I will continue to play with me if there is nothing else. Her eyes deviated and looked towards Kwana behind the spot. The latter blinked at her. This title, Mian knows who he is now. Uchiha's knuckles scratched the palm of his hand, his teeth nibbled on the tip of his tongue, and he didn't know what to say for a moment. Although it was not an accident for Ban to come across Mian here, he didn't actually think of what to do. He just felt that he might need to meet her once. But according to her tone, she seems to know Quan Na. Ban was clean all over, without the embarrassment of that day, and the bandage was almost removed. The fatal injury was cured by宇智波眠in the early days, and the remaining minor injuries were properly handled after returning to the clan's territory. After 3 or 4 days, everything was well and well. Finally, Ban remained silent for a moment, realizing that he was a bit speechless for a moment. He could only throw a questioning look at Uchiha Kwana, trying to cover up his embarrassment. "I'm here to give you something." However, Uchiha seemed to not pay much attention to his elder brother's gaze, and just took a few steps to stand beside Uchiha. "How has the injury recently healed?" His eyes scanned his sleeping body a few times without noticing any obvious scars. "Okay, it's pretty good," Mian replied casually, taking a few steps forward. She rolled up her cuffs and stood in front of Quan Nai, showing him the left arm inside the cuffs, where there were still a few shallow scars left that couldn't be clearly seen without careful examination. "But what about you?" Mian shifted her gaze back to Uchiha, who stared at his face as if waiting for a reply. "It's completely fine. Thanks to your blessings." Uchiha felt uneasy as she looked at him. He curled up his palm and coughed softly, covering his lips. When did these two people become so familiar? He wanted to ask a bit, but Uchiha was present and couldn't speak. "Don't stare at my brother. I brought you dim sum." Uchiha seemed not to notice his brother's uneasiness, and smiled and stuffed the food box into his sleeping arms. He paused for a moment and quickly poked the scar on her hand with his finger. "Is it really great? Don't poke around." Uchiha held the food box and shrank back, as if his already healed and thorough injury had suddenly been stabbed. With a bright smile on her face, she smiled at Quan Nai and said, "Don't say I hit porcelain later. This is your first move." "How can we do that?" "I just moved my finger." Quan Nai raised his hand to show her the culprit's finger, and looked at her with a hint of amusement. "I remember the last time you said that and suddenly fainted. Don't lie about your condition and then suddenly fainted and scared me later." "It said that it was hypoglycemia that time, and it definitely won't be like that today," Mian said casually, waving his hand and shaking the food box in his hand. "But if you're really worried, you can come to my house and watch me eat." She pointed to the nearby courtyard with her free finger. Quan Na paused for a moment and knew that she was really okay. He turned his head to look at her serious face, as if amused. "Okay, then I have to watch you eat, so you don't waste it again. My inner meaning is to let you eat with me, so we won't waste it. You don't know my appetite." Mian Shun tapped his shoulder and then turned his head as if suddenly remembering something. "Ah, but your brother is still standing next to me. Didn't he tell you why he came to me?" After hearing these words, Chuan-Nai instinctively looked at Uchiha next to him, who had a subtle expression on his face. When he turned his head, he also looked back. It's rare for Quan Nai to overlook him so much. "Oh, my brother wants to thank you for treating him on the battlefield a few days ago, probably." Uchiha Chuan-Nai scratched his head as if realizing that Ban was still nearby, and replied as if suddenly remembering the main mission. "So I have to thank you too," he smiled. After all, the situation was quite dangerous. So why is he standing here like a standing post? Uchiha didn't pay attention to the thank you later on, but leaned over to Quan Nai's ear and whispered to him, his fingers bent and pointing to Uchiha, who had not moved much so far. However, she seemed to have never thought about the issue of ninjas having better hearing. Uchiha lowered his eyes, glanced at Uchiha Kwana and Uchiha Mian, and pursed his lips. He glanced at the food box in his sleeping arms, then glanced at his empty hands, and after a moment of contemplation, turned around and walked towards the path he had come. Fast as if something was chasing after him. He only left one last sentence. "Chuan-Nai thanked me for it, so I'll leave first." "Is your brother always so strange?" Uchiha glanced at Uchiha as he walked away, casting a puzzled look at Kwana. "No, it's a bit strange today. Uchiha looked at his brother's figure, hesitated for a moment, and stayed in place. He scratched his face. Perhaps I haven't been in a good mood these days, have I? You're such a strange guy. Uchiha came to her final conclusion, turned around and grabbed Quan Na's sleeve. She called out to Quan Na and then pulled him towards the yard on her own. Quan Na, who was facing her in the opposite direction, was forced to follow her backwards, and the ponytail on the back of his head swayed like a dog-tail grass. Why do you always walk with me like this? Quan Na complained somewhat resentfully, but still let her pull at her sleeve and walk, even somewhat indulgent. I thought you were getting used to it, Mian replied casually, his eyes parted to the ponytail behind his head. It really looks like a small tail. This is beneficial for your exercise and enhances your ability to sense the back of your brain. She casually fabricated lies that Uchiha Chuanai would never believe again after the age of 6, and plunged into her yard. This courtyard belonged to her family's residence about 2 years ago, but since her parents passed away, there has been only one younger brother living with her. After turning left in the porch for a few turns, Yuzhibo stopped at the entrance of his room. First, he casually kicked his shoes aside, then barefoot stepped on the tatami mat and turned his hand to place the food box on the low table. Then sit casually cross-legged. Sit casually. Mian tapped the table with her fingertips. Now is the end of summer, and the early autumn wind blows in from the wide open door, which has a refreshing effect. Standing at the door, Uchiha Chuanai gathered his coat and closed the door, then bent down and neatly arranged Uchiha's shoes and his own. Can't you behave a little bit? Quan Nai patted his sleeping head with some seriousness. He walked to the side cabinet, took out the tea set placed nearby, cooked 2 cups of tea with ease, and then turned back to sit next to his sleeping seat. Sleepy's mouth emitted a blurry syllable, and she raised her hand to follow the area that had been patted before reaching out to pat Quanna's hand to express dissatisfaction. Sitting across from me, it's squeezing me to death. Have you had lunch yet? Chuanai's hand steadily pushed the cup of hot tea to her. Without answering her words, he just took the lid of the food box and put those dim sum that Uchiha could not give an exact name on the table. I'm eating now. Mian casually picked up a red pastry with her fingertips and stuffed it into her mouth, responding with a blurry voice while eating. Quan Nai knew something was wrong from her appearance. He picked up the teacup and stared at her without hesitation. Reminder. Be careful not to choke. Cough cough cough. What did I say? Quan Nai handed the teacup to Mian's mouth and watched her struggle to drink most of the tea before patting her behind the back with her palm. Be careful, Amin. He earnestly leaned his face in front of her and reached out to trim her messy forehead. Why don't you continue to call her sister? Mian blocked his face with her hand and groaned her neck. I didn't know to call my name just now. Did your brother know to call me when he left? Quanna breathed a sigh of relief and ignored her question. He sat slowly upright, lowered his head and took a sip of the tea still in his hand. The warm touch left him stunned for a moment, and then he took a sip as if nothing had happened. Guess how many bad words I told my brother about you? Quan Nai glanced at me and added softly, you don't want your benefactor to become your enemy, do you? And there are quite a few people who call you sister. Quan Nai recalled the popularity of sleeping among his tribe, and then thought of Mian's legitimate younger brother who looked very cold. He added a sentence to his heart. What did you say to him? Sleeping stiffly touched the spines behind his neck, and the silver rings on his wrists collided with each other, making a crisp sound. Secret. Chuan casually stuffed a piece of cake into her mouth, pressed her lips with his fingertips, and gently rubbed them. Fill your stomach before that, right? Chapter 3. Going Out. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It was said to fill the stomach, but the pastry basically went into Quan Na's stomach. I don't really like sweet things, so I didn't eat much. However, Adhering to the principle of not wasting, Mian chose to secretly put all the pastries into Quan Na's mouth while he relaxed his guard while chatting with her. Don't waste food, After half an hour of diligent feeding, she looked at the leftover food box and nodded with a satisfied expression. She casually pinched Quan Na's face and put on a serious expression. Her fingers pointed at the corner of Quan Na's mouth and then at the side of the food box, ready to carry out the decision of overturning the rake to the end. You've finished all the pastries, I'm not completely full now. What do you say? Mian leaned her face close to Quan Na, her beautiful eyes staring straight at him, as if trying to make him feel some pressure. She then added, how can you compensate me? Quan Na glanced at the face of Xiao Ren Deji, bent his eyes, and decided to cooperate with this scene. Quan Na slightly bent forward, bringing the distance between the two closer. But it was my sister who kept feeding me just now. Quan Na knows how to act coquettishly, just use a soft tone and drag the ending tone for a long time. Sleeping usually can't resist this, so how can I be blamed for this? He murmured, his warm breath spreading over his sleeping face, causing a tingling sensation. He frowned pitifully and pursed his mouth. The upper lip line is more prominent. It's too close. Quan Na trembled her eyes and lowered her head slightly. Curled upper eyelashes and ink-black eyes. And there were a few strands of hair hanging down from her face, as well as warm, somewhat pale but beautiful lips. Lips. He couldn't help but recall the lingering touch of the teacup, and Quan Na suddenly felt that there seemed to be a warm feeling on his lips, which made him nervous a bit. However, as soon as Mian reached out, she moved Quan Na's face to one side. Her expression looked very serious, as if she didn't want to be tricked by beauties. You have no evidence, Quan Na. I mean, you have to trust me. Quan Na leaned back and reached out to pinch the slightly reddened earlobe. My eyes were a bit erratic. He didn't know how many times he was grateful for his constitution not to blush, but he still hadn't forgotten to continue fighting against Mian. How can I believe you? Mian raised an eyebrow, seemingly determined that he couldn't find any evidence to prove it. She glanced at his earlobe and chuckled softly. Chuan-Nai looked at her in a daze for a few seconds, then exhaled after a brief pause. Then the corner of his mouth pulled up, revealing a sudden smile of determination. He reached down and touched the palm of Summer's leg, gently covering the back of her hand with his fingers. Finally, he clasped her wrist and flipped his hand, lifting it up with her slender hand. Sleeping fingers were slightly thinner than him, and his skin was even fairer. The blue blood vessels covered the back of the hand, adding a touch of fragility. Quan Na lowered her gaze and gently pinched her wrist, while her other hand gently held her index finger in place. Then he lowered his head and quickly extended his tongue to lick her fingertips. The soft tip of his tongue brushed over her knuckles, causing a tingling itch on the scalp. Before she could react to her sleep, Quan Na gave her a brief smile. Is it sweet, Amin? Quan Na leaned in front of Mian's face and rubbed her cheeks with his nose every inch, the soft touch making him squint his eyes. He smelled the scent that belonged to Amian. It is the fragrance of perfume lily, pure and flawless, just like Amian. Don't be like a puppy. Mian reacted for a while before remembering to poke Quan Na's cheek hard with her fingers and use all her strength to poke his face open. The other hand is pulling a piece of horsetail behind his head around the back, just like pulling the tail of a dog, sleeping in the heart and secretly roast. Chuan-Nai leaned back with her strength and innocently blinked his beautiful eyes. Mian frowned as she looked at Quan Na, adding to her strength as if she had made some kind of criticism of his behavior. Why are you still using children's tricks? Quan Na then retreated back, avoiding the finger that Mian continued to poke forward, and reached out to grab her wrist. He touched his face and gently bit the soft flesh in his mouth, trying to hold down the corner of his excited mouth that was about to curl up. Pretending to be serious, he asked, does this evidence count? Just Lord Amian. The young man's palm has a thin cocoon, but it also carries a strong sense of warmth. Not really. Mian could only stand up suddenly. She gently pulled out her wrist and rubbed Quan Na's head a few more times. You are committing a foul, cunning young master Uchiha Chuanai. Now you have to compensate me. Accompany me out later. Mian finally revealed her long-planned conspiracy, but for Quanna, it was more like a relaxing vacation activity than punishment. Mian walked a few steps towards the door, then turned around to instruct Quan Na. Take the food box with you. Also, pack up my tea set. I'll wait for you outside. Mian bent down, put on her shoes, and opened the door. The evening breeze blowing towards her made her shiver slightly, dissipating the warmth that had just risen in the room. She rubbed her arms and stepped out of the door, leaving Chuanai inside to clean up the mess. Quan Na watched her back as she walked out of the door, rubbing her fingertips against the completely cooled rim of the cup. He lowered his eyes and murmured softly. You always treat me like a child right away. Sleeping at the edge of the hallway, holding my cheeks to see the blooming flowers in the yard. Her mother and brother love to play with these plants, so there are flowers and plants everywhere in the house. But after his mother passed away, his younger brother didn't want to touch the flowers left behind, and over time, no one took care of them. Most of these flowers and plants have turned yellow and withered due to lack of care, and only some wild grass-like flowers in the yard are still blooming tenaciously. The swaying stamens and spreading petals showcase a rare vitality. When it comes to autumn, there is always a feeling of depression. Sleeping with my chest in my arms, leaning against my crooked waist. If my father sees me, he will definitely say something. The sound of closing the door came from behind, and the sound of sliding tracks came slowly and steadily, which was Quan Na's style. A warm piece of clothing draped over the shoulder, and the feeling of coldness was immediately banned. Mian turned her head to one side, and Quan Na was carefully breaking open her hand and stuffing it into her wide sleeve. It's not easy for me to take your clothes. You can make do with it first. Don't let it get cold. I'll feed you congee later. Quan Na's eyelashes are long and a bit beautiful.宇智波眠was a bit lost in thought. She stood up with Quan Na's strength, letting him seriously tie the belt around her waist. Quan Na is now taller than her, and her clothes are naturally a bit larger. She rolled up her slightly wide sleeves and hesitated for a moment before pulling at Quan Na's hem. Probably because he took off his coat, he looked a bit thin and pitiful. Come over a little bit, Mian's slightly dry voice rang out, and she continued to pull Quan Na's hem to signal him to get closer. What's wrong? Quan Na let her tug at the corner of her clothes and took him over, and he gently lowered his head. With a habitual smile. Mian didn't answer him, just got closer and gave Quan Na a warm embrace. She stretched her slender arms around his neck, her face slanted against his, and the strands of hair on her forehead entwined with him. She touched Quan Na's head with her hands, her voice gentle, with a hint of warmth. Thank you, Quanna. Chapter 4. Foraging. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Although she brought the person out, Mian actually didn't even think about where to go specifically, so she decided to let Quan Na take her away. She was wrapped in Quan Na's coat, with a long back hem hanging behind her legs, which made her somewhat absurd and funny. Although it looked a bit out of place, she couldn't resist the cold autumn evening breeze and wanted to shiver, so she had to tighten her tight coat. Mian hid the lower half of her face under the collar of her coat, and carefully pulled Quan Na's fingertips, just like a few fingers exposed from the long sleeves. She's feeling a bit cold and has a headache, so she didn't pay much attention to anything else. Quan Na, aren't you cold? She followed Quan Na step by step, grinding her teeth as she watched his thin back and hooked his little thumb. Quan Na turned around and glanced at her in a plain tone. He had just emerged from a somewhat inexplicable feeling, and his ears were still slightly red. Well, it's okay, isn't it? The temperature here isn't particularly cold either. Quan Nai simply pulled her finger towards the palm of her hand, wrapped it inside her palm, and gently rubbed it a few times. Only Amin, do you feel too cold to bear it? Sleeping hands are always cold in spring, summer, autumn, and winter, and Quan Na has become accustomed to it. When she was younger, Mian would even put her hand into his collar. At most, Quan Nai would just pull her hand out and stuff it into his arms. Finally, he scolded her warmly for 1 or 2 words before warming her hands seriously. My sleeping body is slightly weaker than that of an ordinary person, and I don't know if I have some body cold. Usually, when it cooled down, it started to repeatedly heat up, but it scared Kwana a lot. Sleeping vaguely, he replied with a syllable, then calmly let him grab his hand. She walked slowly side by side with Quan Na on the path, with the tall tree trunks around casting shadows on the ground, giving off a somewhat eerie sense of tranquility. Quan Na, where are you taking me? The sound of sleeping was slightly subdued, giving people a feeling of laziness. Quan Na felt that she didn't seem to care too much about where to go, but she also seemed to have a vague expectation. Take you for a picnic. Chuan-I pondered the wording, but felt it was not quite accurate. Isn't it not that you're not full? Let me find you something to eat. Oh, foraging. Mian nodded casually. She had just wanted to go out and breathe freely, so she didn't have any extra thoughts, so she naturally followed him. Her brain cells seemed to have blown away with the oncoming evening breeze, and for a while, she would not have much thinking ability. Quan Nai's little dog took his sister out to search for food. Mian always feels like there is such a visual sensation. She followed for a long distance in a daze, then squatted beside to watch Quan Nai build a circle with stones and throw scattered wooden branches inside. Then he made a few seals and spat out a flame towards the inside. A warm flame emerged from the pit, carrying a dry warmth. Sleeping beside the fire, swaying her legs, she reached out her hand and leaned towards the fire, where the warm orange flames emitted sporadic sparks. Sleeping in the firelight, I watched Quan Nai walk back with 2 rabbits in hand, and then looked at his hazy face illuminated by the firelight for a moment before realizing something. I reached out to touch the hem of my clothes. I'll lend you my knife. She gently threw the close-fitting short knife towards Quanna's side. The blade shone brightly, and with a slight click, the blade of the short knife penetrated into the wooden stake next to Quanna, neither deep nor shallow. Thank you. Quan Nai pulled out his knife and neatly began to peel off the snow-white skin outside. His knife skills were very good, and soon 2 complete rabbit skins were thrown aside. He skewered some bloody rabbit meat onto the shaved and clean short branches, then shook his hand and handed it to Mian. Mian took the branch with meat and flipped it over in the flames. Her barbecue skills are not particularly proficient, and even somewhat clumsy, but she herself has a strong interest in using fire to cook things. Chuan-I glanced at Mian, who was focused on grilling meat, shook his head and consciously got up to find a stream of water. After carefully washing my hands, I carefully cleaned my sleeping knife again. Quan Na touched the words engraved on the handle of the short knife, chuckled lightly, and then stood up and walked back.宇智波眠hates getting blood very much, which he knew a long time ago. Although this preference may seem a bit delicate for ninjas, it seems quite normal when it comes to Uchiha Mian. She always has conflicting points of all sizes on her body, and when mixed together, it seems like she is in perfect harmony. Amin is really a very special person. He has always felt this way. Quan Na, here you are. He held up the rabbit meat that seemed to be cooked enough in front of Quan Na like a sleep invitation, and when someone picked it up, he held his chin and stared at him. Don't you want to eat? Quan Na raised her eyebrows and looked at the 2 pieces of meat she was holding in her hand. She then reached out to the fire and continued flipping through them. I've been feeling a bit nauseous eating meat lately, so I don't feel like eating it. Mian glanced at Quan Na's movements and pursed her mouth. I've recently switched to being a vegetarian. Why do you feel nauseous? Quan Nai frowned and carefully scanned her up and down. Ah, it's just, it's been like this since I went to the battlefield before. Mian squinted her eyes, seeming unsure how to express this matter. In short, it was said by the members of the clan, probably due to psychological reasons. I feel like eating meat is a bit like gnawing on decaying corpses now. Mian casually pressed her curled hair, her tone light, as if she wasn't particularly interested in this topic. And where is your writing will I? Was it also opened at that time? Quan Nai clenched her fingers on the branch and asked in a suppressed voice. The story of Shuang Goyu was told by his brother. At that time, he only thought it was normal to put it on Amin. Now, when he really heard her say it himself, he felt a bit hoarse and sad. Is it because your family? Chuanai and Mian were not on the same battlefield at that time, but he finally heard some rumors. Since her parents passed away, she seems to have become quite indifferent. Although she doesn't seem to be different from him, Quan Na can notice her aggravated dark circles under her eyes. He remembers that Huamian had just returned from the battlefield he participated in for the first time and had already suffered many injuries. She only opened her eyes when she received her parents' belongings from the returning tribe while resting at home. And soon after, he had a fever, and he and his sleeping brother took care of each other for several days before they finally recovered. Quan Nai didn't know how Mian suppressed her emotions and how she persisted without saying anything until now. She seemed to be feeling down a lot, but it wasn't obvious enough for Quan Nai to find an opportunity to ask her. Quan Na didn't want her to recall the heartbreak, but he couldn't help but want to probe and touch her wound. Mian is a gentle and intelligent person, but not good at dealing with her own problems. She always likes to avoid problems, even if she is injured, she just allows the wound to worsen. They have known each other since the age of 4 or 5, but many years have passed now. Quan Na is so familiar with her, how could she not see her depression? During this long period of time, Quan Na's feelings for Mian seemed to have become unclear, but he was very, very concerned about her. Quan Nai's fingers rubbed against the surface of the branches unnaturally, and he lowered his eyes, making it difficult for Mian to see clearly. Probably, replied sleepily, you know, it made me feel a bit dizzy and I couldn't remember many details. She gazed at the flickering sparks, as if suddenly developing a perfectly fitting interest in this thing. She buried her face in her collar again, feeling as if her whole body was enveloped by Quan Na's breath. Quan Na always gives her an extra sense of peace of mind, so much so that as long as she sleeps near him, she unconsciously relaxes a bit. Even when it comes to some solemn topics like writing will eyes, she maintains a relatively appropriate level of relaxation. She knew that Quan Na had also opened her eyes, even earlier than her. What obligation does Quan Na, who is also open-minded, have to alleviate her problems when she doesn't want to appear too fragile? Sleeping is not a person with a fragile mentality, she prefers to bear this hardship. Quan Na didn't reply, he was a bit distracted. The twig strung with rabbit meat was directly inserted into the ground on one side by him. His usually upturned lips were slightly stiff and pursed, causing him to sleep and feel uneasy. Quan Na has actually worked very hard. I hope he can be more relaxed when he is near me. Sleeping slowly, I wriggled a few times and gradually moved to the side of Quan Na. She held Quan Na's head in her hand and gently leaned him against her shoulder. Actually, I've forgotten quite a bit. Sleeping softly, she followed Quan Na's hair one by one, as if comforting him every time in the past. At that time, the fire was quite severe, but I didn't really remember the details anymore, she said calmly. Maybe I didn't remember much, so there was a sense of unreality. Every time she heard others talk about her deceased parents, Mian suddenly realized that she really didn't have parents anymore. In fact, she didn't even know which day her parents died on. She didn't want to discuss this matter with others anymore, nor did she want to know the story of that day. She probably wasn't particularly upset, was she? Even unable to shed a single tear. Looking at the two wooden boxes containing her eyes, she only felt a sense of confusion. Don't worry, Kwana. Mian tilted her head and affectionately rubbed against Kwana. At least I still have you and Awang. Actually, I am quite a child. Quan Nai obediently leaned against his sleeping shoulder, thinking vaguely. So, won't you eat too? Mian pointed to the branch Quan Na was holding in his hand. Well, I'm already full anyway. Take this back for my brother to eat, Quan Na shrugged and added casually. Brother can eat it, don't worry. Sleeping for a moment, she felt a bit stuttered. She glanced at the slightly burnt rabbit meat and decided to remain silent on this matter, feeling pitiful for a few seconds from the bottom of her heart. Let's go, aren't you not full? I'll go find some vegetarian food for you later and send you back. Kwana held her hand with one hand and smiled at her. Chapter 5. Request. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Oh, it seems like we've caught up in some amazing plot. Mian reached out and picked up a strawberry from a plate on one side. This plate of strawberries was brought by Quan Nai when he came. At this moment, Mian was lazily lying on the floor of the corridor, while it was raining outside. The pattering raindrops hit the eaves, making a slightly regular sound. On a rainy day, it's perfect for sleeping. Before Wang left, he had already asked him to bring an umbrella, hoping he would remember to use it. Sleeping in my heart murmuring, my eyes trembling slightly. She was wearing Chuan-Nai's coat, and every time she met Chuan-Nai since autumn, he worried that she would get cold, so Chuan-Nai's coat basically never returned to him. Sleepily holding his face, he turned his head to listen to Quan Nai's instructions for what to do tomorrow and smacked his lips, feeling like fate was manipulating him. Well, she once had a mindset of wanting Quan Nai to cherish her life and tried hard to start education from a young age. So, since the two of them were throwing their frustrations together in the training ground, Mian kept instilling in his ear the idea of precious life and not ignoring others and her own destiny. She didn't actually have much expectation for this measure in her heart, after all, the world is unpredictable. Even ninjas in the Warring States period had this consciousness and had to resort to killing each other with other ninjas, such as the Thousand-Armed Clan, which is a good example. However, what Mian never expected was that such insignificant remarks would allow Quan Na to protect the two second sons of the Chisho family one after another on the battlefield. What are those two children called, like Weijian and Banjian? Well, she never thought that Banjian could be saved by Chuan-Nai. After all, according to her vague memory, Chuan-Nai would hate her brother and sisters very much because they were killed. Does he have no reason to save a child with 1,000 hands? Mian felt that the plot was a bit strange from here on. However, at that time, Mian could only reach the age to gather numbers on the battlefield, and even if he wanted to save the plot characters, he didn't have much strength to achieve it. Moreover, there is no mention of the specific time and location of this incident in the plot, and Mian herself does not have the ability to defy the heavens and let her roam among ninjas at a young age. Therefore, Banjian and Weijian, the two children, Mian, were originally saved without hope. However, Quan Na was like the butterfly that caused cause and effect due to her unconscious behavior, indifferent flapping her wings in the corner, causing the original plot to be blown apart. In summary, after experiencing the experiences of Weijian and Banjian, Kwana got to know Qianshou Zhujian and Qianshou Kaijian in advance, which led to the unexpected advancement of the storyline between Uchiha and Qianshou Zhujian. In the original plot, Kwana, who was extremely disgusted with the Qianshou clan, actually agreed to their relationship. These were all told to her by Quan Nai, because Mian's clear understanding of her own strength left her with little time to join the fun. So the Nanagawa 3v3 incident, which was supposed to have ended long ago, has been delayed until now. Because Kwana provided cover for Ban, and Ima chose to turn a blind eye because of Kwana's kindness in saving his two younger brothers. And sleep. She herself seemed to be absent from the entire scene, but it seemed to indirectly affect something. Anyway, I have to go with Brother Ban tomorrow to go find Watermelon Head and Hedgehog Head to perform a scene for the parents on both sides. Quan Na frowned with a worried expression, feeling even more that this accident was really troublesome. So I can't go out with you tomorrow, Amin. His somewhat gloomy expression made Mian find it very interesting. Well, it's okay. Uchiha Mian still held her chin and blinked at Chuanai. She picked up a strawberry with her fingertips and raised her arm to hand it to Chuanai. Bow your head, ah. Ah. Quan Na leaned down and took a bite of the strawberry, squinting her eyes in satisfaction and sighing, it's so sweet. He slowly bit the sleeping hand several times before finishing the strawberry, and before leaving, he pretended to take a gentle bite of the sleeping finger. Don't be like a puppy, Mian gave him a weak glare, then reached out and stuffed the last strawberry into Quan Na's mouth. Glancing at Quan Na's bulging cheeks, Mian finally released the hand that supported her chin with a hint of pleasure, and put her head on Quan Na's lap. Oh, how about I go with you tomorrow? Mian blinked and stared at Quan Na's jawline. The teenage boy's face has faded a bit of immaturity, and his facial features are gradually growing. There are no unattractive people in the Uchiha family, while Quan Na belongs to the very beautiful type. Why are you going? Quan Na lowered her head and pulled the broken hair blocking her face aside for the girl lying on her lap. His fingers gently caressed his sleeping hair, with a puzzled expression on his face. I want to see how you fight with that thousand-handed man, Mian blinked and crossed her hands on her lower abdomen. She really liked Quan Na helping her tidy her hair. I'll stay in the nearby bushes and won't let them see. Besides, after the fight, we can also stop by the market, okay? Mian reached out and poked Quan Na's cheek, looking at him with a very pitiful expression. If I can't go out with you tomorrow, I will be very lonely. And tomorrow, Ah Wang will also go to the training ground as usual, which will make me very bored. After pausing for a moment, I observed Quan Na's face and then added, I can go to Nanha River to wait for you in advance, right where we usually catch fish. Quan Na glanced at her and let out a sigh. Okay, he said, but you need to stay away from those three guys in the Qianqiu family, especially between the Qianqiu Buddha and the Qianqiu Gate. Quan Na reached out and forcefully poked her forehead, leaving two subtle red marks on her pale skin, causing Mian to let out a painful cry. I don't want you to get hurt. Mian blinked, while Quan Na looked at her seriously, her gentle expression showing full concern. I know. Mian responded in a low voice and grabbed his hand, flipping over and getting up from him. She stretched down, yawned, and shifted her gaze to the continuously falling raindrops. The foggy gray outside limited the visibility around. She lowered her eyes and glanced at the tenacious wild flowers blooming outside. Raindrops falling from the sky hit the soft petals heavily, causing a tremor. The previous water droplets jumped on the petals and fell leisurely to the ground. She tilted her face again and met Quan Na, who was staring at her. It seems that Quan Na has been staying in the cold air for a while, and her eyelashes are also covered in a thin layer of water vapor. His dark eyes were like an indelible mist, hazily covering his sleeping heart, feeling as if he had been gently crushed by a hand. Sleeping and looking at him, suddenly remembered a sentence. Uchiha's eyes can speak. Perhaps it is true that one can speak, sleepily thinking. I don't know if her eyes can also say, maybe they can. Otherwise, why did Chuanai keep staring at her? She was stunned for a moment, then noticed a blurry reflection in Quan Na's eyes. For some reason, perhaps the atmosphere was just right. Mian reached out and covered Quan Na's eyes with her fingers, her voice carrying a hint of confusion. Perhaps it contains the feeling of helplessness that comes into this world alone. Mian gently called out to him. Chuanai. She looked at him for a long time, but felt like she couldn't see enough. If Quan Na doesn't accompany her, she is actually a bit lonely. You should go back now, Mian said again. Mian stared at Quan Na, who was blindfolded by her. She scrutinized the strands of hair in front of his forehead, her gaze brushing over his slightly plump lips and brushing his pursed lips. Finally, she looked at the black eyes that were leaking out from the gaps between her fingers. Quan Na's eyelashes trembled gently, rubbing against her sleeping palm, causing a slight itching sensation. He seemed to be just staring at her seriously and peacefully. There are still many things to do tomorrow. Mian Piantu withdrew her hand and gently rubbed the palm of her hand with her fingers. Can you go back and enlighten your brother first? I feel like he might be depressed for a long time. She tilted her head and avoided Quan Na's gaze. Oh yes, I'll give you the clothes. Mian scratched her neck, lowered her head, and reached out to untie the waistband of her coat, but her hand seemed to be disobedient, almost tying the waistband tightly back to her waist. Okay, Kwana lowered her head and pressed it against her forehead. Reaching out to help her untie her tightly knotted belt, she lowered her eyes and took off her coat. Finally, follow the sleeping motion and let her put it on for herself. The fabric of the coat still carried a slight warmth from his sleeping body, soft and hanging on his skin. So goodbye tomorrow, Amin. Quan Nai held up the umbrella that Mian Chang had given him, turned around and waved to her, jumping into the rain curtain. He paused in the yard for a moment, then jumped out of the fence. Take the main entrance, you. Mian shouted at his back, then let out a soft sigh towards the direction he was leaving. There was only the sound of rainwater falling nearby, and the entire courtyard was shrouded in a continuous mist. Mian turned around and walked into the room, gently closing the door to isolate the air conditioning and dampness from outside. Chapter 6. Opening Eyes. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The weather is cloudy, and the location is Nanagawa River. The main figures on the left are Uchiha Ban, Uchiha Kwana, and Uchiha Taijima. The main characters on the right are Qian Shou Zhu Jian, Qian Shou Fang Jian, and Qian Shou Buddha Jian. Sitting on the branch in the corner was Miss Yuji Bomian, the live streamer of the war. Mian propped her cheeks and looked at the 6 people not far away, shaking her legs with a hint of anticipation. After all, I can see so many key figures at once. This is the first time she has seen the 1,000-armed Buddha and the pillar. Fei Jian has seen it a few times before. Okay, this event is also a significant plot point in the original work, and it's not an exaggeration to expect it. But the most important thing is, there are many scenes in Kwana. After all, she hasn't seen Quan Na's combat posture in a long time. Mian is more accustomed to introducing opponents into the forest to knock them unconscious and then fishing around on his own, so there is relatively little opportunity to observe Kwana on the battlefield. Since Mian was about 13 years old and had her last fight with Quan Na at the training ground, she has never seen Quan Na fight again. But now we can see enough. And Kwana won't get hurt yet. This is a great opportunity. Thinking of this, Mian widened her eyes excitedly, attempting to incorporate every movement of Quan Na standing below into her eyes. Of course, occasionally I would also give some eye contact to the nearby spots and pillars. Well, there's absolutely no point in not being interested. Mian shook her head and looked at Kwana with bright eyes. Quan Na tightly held his sword in both hands, wearing purple abdominal armor for combat on his abdomen. He had a solemn expression on his face, his eyes fixed straight on the 1,000-handed door across from him. The momentum on both sides was a bit tense, making me feel a bit nervous. These guys should remember that this time they were just acting, right? In the long stalemate, the battle erupted instantly with the subtle movements of both sides. Fei Jian first rushed towards Quan Na's direction, while Ban and Zhu Jian also started moving at the same time. Uchiha Hirata Island and 1,000-armed Buddha quickly engaged in a fight on the side after speaking harshly. They are quite strict in their grouping. Mian glanced at the whole room, then quickly locked her eyes on Quan Na and Fei Jian. The blades of Quan Na and Fei Jian were tightly intertwined, constantly scraping and rubbing against each other, causing a stalemate. After a brief retreat, the two quickly charged and swung towards each other, their blades colliding and emitting sharp piercing sounds. It seems that they should grasp the right balance. However, the more I looked at it, the more I felt something was wrong. They were fighting each other as if they had hit their heads, and after the initial probing, they began to continuously attack each other's vital points. Seeing a bloodstain on Quan Na's face, she couldn't sit still. She silently opened the double Goyu, then dug out the Kowu and explosive talisman from her ninjutsu bag, combined them together and held them in her hand. She took advantage of the gap between the two and avoided Kwanna, quickly picked up the detonating talisman and threw it straight at the foot of the door. Kowu made a piercing sound and then firmly nailed himself to the foot of the door. After a few breaths, a violent explosion occurred. Quan Na almost immediately noticed the bitterness thrown from beside him. He turned around and met Mion's eyes. He was momentarily stunned as he looked at the black eyes, then quickly reacted and jumped back quickly. At the same time, Fei Jian also discovered the detonating talisman Ku Wu. He quickly retreated a few steps to withdraw from the explosion range, and then instinctively looked towards Quan Na's gaze, also discovering the sleeping creature half squatting on the tree. "Why did you bring assistance?" Qianqiu's eyebrows furrowed tightly, and before he could see Qingyan's appearance carefully, his gaze was blocked by the debris blown away by the detonating talisman. When the smoke dissipated and looked back, Mion had already jumped into the grass. Just a reminder not to get too involved in the show, Quan Nai didn't answer his question directly, but waved his knife towards the door. He pursed his lips, and one of his subordinates forcefully drew back the attention of Fei Jian. "It's clearly you who started it." Fei Jian caught Quan Na's blade with the back of his knife and turned his wrist to push him away. He glared at Quan Na, and the two became entangled and engaged in a fierce battle. Mion continued to stare at the two people from the gap in the grass. Every time Quan Na was scratched, she would find an opportunity to throw various hidden weapons, including swords, kowu, explosive talismans, and even ordinary stones in her hand, all of which greeted Fei Jian's body. Before long, colorful decorations were hung all over Fei Jian's body. 1,000 hands furrowed their brows and gritted their teeth. No matter how slow he is now, he knows that the guy hiding in the dark is warning him. Another detonating talisman painstakingly brushed against his cheek, creating an arc in the air and exploding at the foot of the pillar not far behind. Almost caused the pillar to fly to one side and get stabbed by a spot. This made those two people also look towards the side of the door. "Fei Jian. Are you okay over there?" The voice of Qian Shuzu came from one side, full of doubt. Fei Jian finally couldn't bear it anymore and withdrew from Quan Na's sword, rubbing against Quan Na's side and rushing straight towards the direction of sleep. "Hey!" Quan Na was caught off guard by Fei Jian. He watched as he raised his sword and chopped down the grass where Mion was hiding, his eyes instantly widened. He turned around and ran quickly towards his sleeping position. "Wait a minute." He saw the knife in the door strike straight into his sleeping body. He missed it. Quan Nai's eyes instantly turned pitch black, and 3 bright red jade objects spun rapidly in his eyes. "Amin." He anxiously called out her name and swung his knife towards the back shoulder of the door, with a strong killing intent that had appeared for the first time today. "Wait a moment." Fei Jian flashed his blade, and he glanced at Quan Na, who was running straight after him, and retreated somewhat awkwardly. "Are you crazy?" Quan Na's Sangoyu in his eyes spun rapidly, and with a flick of his wrist, he launched a series of attacks towards Fei Jian, almost to the death. "She's okay." Kazuma's shoulder was hit by Quan Nai's blade, his eyebrows furrowed tightly, and his hands exerted force, using the knife to open Quan Nai's sword and shouting at him. "Open your eyes wide, that's a stunt double. Fire escape. The art of Heo Wokyu." Quan Na paused for a moment, then spit out a huge fireball towards the door before stopping and turning his head to look at the position where Mion had just been. There was a broken piece of wood lying on the ground, and Mion herself stood beside it. She was holding a short knife in her hand and looking at Quan Na with concern. Quan Na's hand tightly gripped the handle of the Tai Dao, and his chest heaved violently. He scanned Sleepy's body tightly and only breathed a sigh of relief when he confirmed that there were no wounds on her body. His hands kept trembling, and his face was still a bit pale. "I'm fine." Mian quickly made a few mouth movements towards Quan Na, then pointed to Zhu Ban who was rushing towards him, jumped onto the branch behind him, and looked at Quan Na with concern before turning around and rushing towards the distance. "Are you okay?" Qianqiu, Zhu Jian and Ban quickly rushed over. Zhu Jian glanced in surprise at Quan Na, who was bowing his head, and ran towards the half-kneeling door on the ground, rubbing against him. "What's going on?" Uchiha frowned and glanced over, placing his hand on Quana's shoulder. "Are you okay, Quana?" "Brother, I'm fine." Quana covered her eyes, her entire arm trembling. He raised his head slightly and let Yuji Boban take a glance at his eyes, with a somewhat bewildered expression on his face. Sangoyu was still spinning leisurely in his eyes, and Quan Na had not yet been able to fully control it. He took a deep breath. "I thought." His voice trembled with a completely different tone from usual, struggling to utter a few words before biting his lower lip and swallowing the latter half of the sentence. Yuji Boban gave Quan Na a deep glance, remained silent for a while, and bent down to give his younger brother a hug. "It's okay." Although he was not sure what exactly happened, he still comforted and patted Quan Na's back before getting up. "Hey, take your little brother back over there." Bangkong called out from the position of the Qianqiu brothers, and walked towards the position of the two tribal chiefs with one hand supporting Quana's shoulder. "Now is a good opportunity to stop fighting." Uchiha Hirata Island and Thousand Armed Buddha naturally discovered this upheaval. They didn't distinguish between high and low, just holding weapons and occupying one side each. Ban supported Quan Na and stood behind Tian Dao, while Zhu Jian also carried Fei Jian to the back of Buddha Jian. Both parents glanced at their son behind them, showing completely opposite expressions. Yuji Bodajima was pleasantly surprised when Shuang opened the Quana and Ban of Sanguyu, while Qianqiu Buddha frowned as he looked at Kai Jian, who had suffered many injuries behind the pillar. See, the joys of humanity are not interconnected, and among the 1,000 armed Buddhas, they only feel that the three of Uchiha are eye-catching. The current situation is not very beneficial for both sides. After all, Quan Na has also been injured, and there will be no clear winner in the short term. So after a brief pause, the two tribal chiefs retreated with their children, and before leaving, Quan Na glared fiercely at Zhu Jian. Between columns. After returning to the tribe's territory, Quan Na went to the medical center for a simple bandage before sneaking out. Sleeping on a tree outside the medical center, she threw herself into Quan Nai's arms. Quan Nai wrapped his arms around her thin body and held her tightly. "You scared me to death. You scared me to death." Mian and Chuan-Nai exchanged eyes and opened their mouths to say this sentence at the same time. "Why did you suddenly open your eyes? Did you feel anything uncomfortable?" Mian reached out and touched around his eyes, and Quan Na's eyes had now returned to their normal appearance. Quan Nai pursed his lips as he watched her anxiously, swallowing all the scolding words for sleeping. He lowered his head and buried his face in his sleeping neck. "I'm fine," Chuan-Nai replied softly. His arms tightly wrapped around his sleeping back, and he leaned against his neck, feeling a bit tired, rubbing against it. "As long as you have nothing to do." Mianya reached out and hugged Quana, her fingers passing through his hair, gently caressing his head. "Amin." Quana let out a faint voice as he called her name. "Amin." Sleep can feel a moist sensation coming from the neck. "I'm here." Her voice responded softly and gently to Quana. "I have always been by your side." Her fingers slowly moved behind Quan Nai, raising them to gently caress his spine, and then holding onto his face with both hands. Her eyes were filled with a red jade, which collided directly with Quan Na's eyes. "Take a good rest," she whispered, raising her hand to touch his flushed cheeks and struggling to wrap around Quan Na's body, trying to take him home. Chapter 7. Sleep. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Amin. Upon hearing the sound, Mian's eyes trembled as she lifted her head from her arms, revealing only a pair of eyes. Quan Na woke up at some point, her beautiful black eyes staring at her. He sat on the sleeping bed leaning against the head of the bed, his fingers twisted uneasily around the gray blanket. Quan Na's face was covered in a thin layer of red, not sure if it was due to a fever or shyness. Mian stared at Quan Na with wet eyes for a while, until Quan Na seemed to be about to jump up and run away before giving up on continuing to stare at him. Ah, does your face seem to be redder? Quan Na, you're awake. Mian looked tired and propped up, using his hand to probe Quan Na's forehead to confirm the temperature, then reached out and brushed the hair on his face behind his ear. She looked at his reddened earlobes and finally confirmed that the blush on his face was only caused by shyness. Poop. Mian withdrew her hand and couldn't help but cover her face with a low smile. Quan Na, you're really cute. She reached out and wiped away the tears from the corner of her eye as she smiled. Forget it, it's not just a fever-burning red, just spare him for now. Ah Mian, Quan Na lowered her head in embarrassment. He originally wanted to complain that she used her Sharingan to make him fall into a coma, but as soon as he saw her, he couldn't speak up and blame her anymore. Quan Na tilted her head and hid her face, avoiding the overly direct gaze of Mientao. He always has an illusion that he will be seen through by sleep, as if he is completely transparent in front of her. What's wrong? Did you have a nightmare? Mian rubbed her eyes and reached out to rub Quan Na's head. Quan Na appeared a bit abnormal. She habitually touched the back of her neck. No, Quan Na responded low and then moved his eyes. It seemed like early morning outside the window, as if he had been taken care of all night. Quan Na's eyes scanned a bunch of withered flowers placed on the windowsill, and he lowered his head to move the injured area. Sure enough, it's already good. Although I don't know the principle, Amin's medical ability is really strong. Really? But you look a bit strange. After a moment of uncertain thought, I opened my Sharingan and observed the chakra flow in Quan Na's body. Is it a sequelae of Writing Will Eyes? But I didn't detect anything wrong. She hesitated for a moment and then reached out to touch Shizunari's head. There was also a slight fever, but it was not particularly severe. As for the external injuries, she has completely healed them, including the one on her face. I'm really okay. Quan Na felt the touch on her forehead and instinctively reached out to grab the sleeping hand and pinch it. He shook his head at the person. It's almost completely fine. I can feel it. Mian looked at him carefully for a while, trying to see any discomfort from him. Finally, out of confidence in their medical abilities and not seeing anything, they gave up. She comforted and touched Quan Na's head again, stood up and prepared to walk out. Amin, where are you going? Quan Na reflexively reached out and grabbed her hand. He frowned, his expression like a panicked little dog. Go get you something to eat. Sleepless helplessly broke his fingers, put his hands back, and habitually rubbed his head. Coming soon, wait for me for a moment, dear baby. Quan Na blinked his eyes, not understanding what the final title meant, but he obediently placed his hand on the blanket, waiting to sleep back. Mian came back with rice and vegetable roll in her hand and turned to sit beside the bed. She looked at Chuanai who was sitting happily and reached for rice and vegetable roll to his mouth. Come on, dear baby. Ah. She smiled as Quan Na finished eating with her hand and wiped the corners of his mouth with a handkerchief. Quan Na frowned and looked at her for a while, feeling that there was something wrong with the picture. His gaze turned around his sleeping face, and suddenly he noticed the heavy black circles under her eyelashes. What's wrong? Mian wiped her hands and placed the handkerchief on the cabinet to the side. She reached out to tenderly trim the hair on Quan Na's forehead. Amin, I'm feeling a bit dizzy. Can you sleep with me for a while? Quan Na held Mian's hand in the back and asked her to hold her cheek. She looked at her pleading with his puppy eyes, her voice soft. Ah, but don't you have to go home and report your safety first? Mian looked at his appearance and unconsciously bent her eyes, pinching his cheek with her fingers. You've been staying with me all night, won't the clan leader and your brother come looking for you? Quan Na remained silent for a moment, then held her sleeping hand and rubbed her cheek. Perhaps he still has a low fever, he looks particularly pitiful. But I don't want to go home now. I want to stay with Amin and rest. Quan Na lowered her eyes slightly aggrieved, tightly gripping her sleeping hand in the palm of her hand. His voice was a bit blurry, like a child playing outside and not wanting to go home. Quan Na knew that his father and brother would definitely be anxious if he didn't go back all night, but after seeing the scene where Mian was pierced by the door, he now only wants to stick to sleep. Quan Na reluctantly held her sleeping hand and rubbed her fingers on the back of her hand. If I go back now, I will definitely not see Amin in the next few days. Mian turned her wrist and affectionately clasped Quan Na's hand. She leaned her head forward and pressed it against Quan Na's forehead, blinking at him. How about taking a break now and explaining to you when you're fully recovered? Quan Na looked at her serious gaze and suddenly felt tens of thousands of butterflies surging in his stomach, crawling densely onto his heart, bringing a slight sourness. Okay, Quan Na responded softly and pursed her lips tightly. He was worried that the sudden emergence of a butterfly from his belly would scare the person he cherished. But how do we explain? Quan Na tilted his eyes and asked in a low voice, but his mind was blank. His rationality is gradually disintegrating as sleep approaches. Don't worry. After all, I can also be considered a pretty good medical ninja, right? Mian simply climbed onto her own bed and gently brought Quan Na down on the bed, then reached out to pull the blanket. I will have a solution, please rest well first. She looked into Quan Na's eyes, paused for a moment, and then added, I'm with you. Quan Na silently grasped Mian's hand, and he brought Mian into the bed with a strap to prevent her from falling. Quan Na's body temperature is still a bit high, and the blanket is also tinged with the warmth on Quan Na's body, full of a warm and harmonious feeling. He pressed his head against his sleeping ear, feeling the breath on her body, and closed his eyes with peace of mind. Quan Na's braids were scattered behind her head, mixed with her sleeping long hair. Black hair was intertwined layer by layer, bent and entangled. Mian also tilted her head and leaned her face towards Quan Na's side. Breathing mixed together, emitting a continuous warmth. Mian lowered her eyes and looked at Quan Na's trembling eyelashes for a long time. She smiled low and slowly closed her eyes. Two people curled up on the same bed, breathing alternately. Their hands were tightly held together under the blanket, inseparable. Chapter 8. Reflection. You are listening at novelfull.audio. I slept until the sunset and finally woke up. She rubbed her eyes in a daze, feeling that Quan Na was sleeping better. Perhaps it's because Quan Na is warmer under the blanket, after all, she is very afraid of the cold. Mian reached out and tugged at the blanket, covering Quan Na tightly. I thought about what to do next. After all, although she said she wanted to explain, there was actually nothing to explain, which was that it was a bit problematic for her to take Quan Na away for a night without authorization. Sleep in my heart and calculate. It seems that her childhood friendship with Chuan is enough to deal with this problem. Although Ban may not have been clear about her before, the clan leader may not have been clear about her. Based on her demonstrated strength, just a brief inquiry from the intelligence team can give a rough idea, as she has also treated other members of the Uchiha clan. Although her deliberate attempts to lure the enemy out and knock them unconscious may seem somewhat bizarre, at least her abilities are recognized by her clan. So considering this layer, it's not a problem to just take Quan Na out for a night of treatment. Is it better to say that the clan leader may still be a bit happy to see it succeed? After all, you can easily find Quan Na here by looking around, and it's impossible to stay quiet all night. Her home is a bit remote, but it is still within the territory of the Uchiha tribe. Moreover, Quan Na suddenly opened her eyes. At that time, she left in a hurry, leaving a lot of marks. Ban may have noticed it, but he didn't come to find her. Therefore, overall, the problem with this matter is not very big. Quan Na quietly opened her eyes, but her head turned to look at her sitting on the side, lost in thought, and she curved her lips. Mian noticed the movements of the person next to her and lowered her head. Quan Na, are you awake? Quan Na noticed the movement of Mian bowing her head and immediately pressed the corner of her mouth, putting on a calm expression. He spoke with a slightly hoarse voice. Are you going to find your brother? Mian reached out and touched his head, and the fever had subsided. She then held her cheeks and thought for a while. Wait. It seems like we can go to the chieftain's mansion for a meal. Mian suddenly thought of this. Anyway, let Wang go to Fan Chuan's place to have a meal tonight in advance, so you don't have to worry about your brother's dinner. At least she helped Quan Na cure everything, isn't it too much to just grab a meal? This should be considered as hard work expenses, right? She even treated him before. Chuan-nai, let's go. Mian eagerly grabbed Chuan-nai's hand and prepared to stand up, thinking that she could go to Chuan-nai's house to take a look and enjoy a meal. It was a little exciting. Let's go grab your brother's food. Mian pulled Quan Na and casually poured him a glass of water as he passed by the table. She watched him drink it before pulling him out. So you didn't come back with Quan Na all night, and the first thing you did when you came over was to grab a meal. Yuji Boban stood at the entrance holding hands and glared at Quan Na, who was sleeping behind her, carrying a hint of displeasure. At this moment, he had a bit of the authority of a young clan leader. I can't say that, at least I helped Quan Na fully recover. Mian took a serious look at Ban, pulled Quan Na to his side, and showed him Quan Na, who was intact. Ban Biao glanced at Quan Na's cheek, where there was a relatively minor injury yesterday. It has now recovered well, with no trace to be found. If he hadn't seen it up close yesterday, he would have suspected he was mistaken. Quan Na, how do you feel? Ban asked. He glanced at Quan Na's eyes, which were no different from usual, and then opened his Sharingan to inspect his chakra flow. After confirming that there was no problem, he closed it. Brother, I'm fine. Quan Na took a few steps forward and stood next to Ban, nodded at him, and then pulled Mian over. Brother, Amin's healing ability is very impressive. He earnestly promoted to Ban and grabbed her hand. The latter naturally hooked his hand and nodded solemnly at the speckled spot, as if expressing the meaning of, what he said is right. Spot glanced at the hand they held together without any trace, and then looked at Yanyan's absent-minded appearance. He felt that they were blocking himself. But looking at his younger brother's ignorant appearance, he could only sigh and give up, then reached out and vigorously rubbed Quan Na's head before continuing to speak. Your abilities are indeed very useful. Ban turned and walked towards the inner courtyard. Quan Na quickly rushed to sleep and blinked, pulling her in. It can even be said to be very important. In my opinion, your abilities are more perfect than the vast majority of medical ninjas in the clan. Banla opened the door and gave a glance to the attendant on the side before stepping into the room. He sat upright at the table, casting a glance at Quan Na. Quan Na nodded and sat beside him, pulling Mian to sleep. So I am a rare talent. Mian casually received it, interrupting Ban's conversation. With a hint of doubt on her face, she tilted her head. This expression doesn't seem abrupt on a teenage girl, but it looks a bit strange on a teenage ninja. Quan Na next to her immediately leaned over and covered her mouth, then turned around to ask for credit and blinked at her. Brother, continue. I have control over Amin. So, I hope you can make good use of your abilities. Ban moved aside and sighed as he looked at the two of them looking out of tune. But let's talk about it next time. After all, this person won't listen. He added a sentence in his mind. It's hard to associate the personality displayed by宇智波眠with the steady and cautious guy in the report. His index finger tapped on the table and recalled the report about Uchiha's sleep. Outstanding therapeutic ability, starting double Goju at the age of 11, with a clean background, and parents dying on the battlefield. From the current perspective, she can be considered a good seedling, let alone she and Quan Na have known each other since childhood and have a deep relationship. He paused for a moment, glanced at the two people whispering next to him, and fell silent for a moment. Mion's face carried a soft smile he had never seen before, his eyebrows stretched out, his cheeks bulging, and the two strands of hair in front of him floated with the rise and fall of his chest. He looks very happy, unlike what he saw in the forest that day. Quan Na, go ask why dinner is not ready yet, Ban said. He glanced at Quan Na and then averted his gaze. Fingers tightened the things in their sleeves. Ah, good. Quan Na immediately stood up, took a few steps outside, then paused and turned to look at Mion before waving at her. Aren't you tired of waiting? I'll help you ask. He took a few steps and quickly walked towards the kitchen. Ah. Mion awkwardly glanced at the spot, touched her neck, and defended herself. Actually, it's not particularly slow. Thank you. Ban didn't look at her, just stared in the direction outside the window. What? Thank you for helping me with that last time, he said solemnly again. Quickly threw something into Mion's hand. Ah. That's okay. Mion opened her palm and glanced at a white headdress that looked like Zaijinju. It looks very small and cute. She blinked and looked at the polished and very round headdress in her hand, suddenly feeling that Ban was also quite cute. But still not as cute as Kwana. She silently added a sentence in her heart. Chapter 9. Ability. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Quan Na happily crossed the threshold with 2 bowls of food in her hands, only to realize that there seemed to be a subtle change in the atmosphere between the two of them when she returned. How to put it, at least you don't have that stiff and awkward feeling anymore. Quan Na's heart twisted for some reason, and after carefully observing and trying to find anything missing, she suddenly noticed that Mion was holding something in her hand, and her mind became clear. No wonder my brother wants to spend it on such an unnecessary and strange reason. So, he wants to give him the thank that you gift he left last time. He lowered his eyes, although there were some speculations about his brother's reaction after being saved by Amin when he returned last time. It was also difficult for him to make any decisions about putting this matter in front of Kwana now. But Chuan-I still has a lot of time to think, and one day he may be able to get a satisfactory result of his thinking about this issue. Quan Na calmly sat back between the two and said hello. He placed the bowl he was holding firmly on the table and asked Mion for help. After the food was placed on the table, dinner began like this. Kwana and Mion sat shoulder to shoulder, occasionally glancing at Mion's slow movements. Although she is verbally very positive about eating, in reality, she doesn't seem so happy when she's about to eat. She likes to do whatever she wants, without thinking about what she needs to do after completing it. Inviting Quan Na out was an example before, but now it's another example to grab a meal. Quan Na secretly observed for a while the movements of her holding chopsticks up and down, and it was clear to her that it was a bit boring. After all, she didn't really like eating, and often Quan Na would pay extra attention to her. If not careful, sleeping may even result in not eating a single meal for several days when there is no task, which is why there was a previously reported fainting due to hypoglycemia. However, at critical moments, it wouldn't be like this, so Chuan-I always felt that she deliberately didn't eat. Perhaps it is also related to too much meat, but there's no other way. After all, ninjas need a lot of nutrition. Can't you find a second ninja who doesn't like to eat, except for the feeling of sleeping. Although he just talked to the kitchen about sleeping restrictions, he just added a few vegetarian dishes separately. Quan Na could only glance at the table again, picking and adding something she knew how to eat to her bowl. "Amin, have a meal," Chuan-Nai whispered as a reminder. He somehow remembered that she didn't eat when she slept to feed him rice and vegetable roll this morning. According to the truth, she should be very hungry. At least she is hungry. Mian looked at the food in the bowl with a hint of sadness, poked it with chopsticks, and finally nibbled on it bit by bit under Quan Na's gaze. She looked a bit listless, and even after a glance, Ban couldn't help but frown. "Are you picky about food?" He lowered his eyes and glanced at the things in her bowl, realizing that she seemed very picky about food. No wonder it looked so petite. He thought about the hand that she could hold onto his wrist and her pale and slender neck at the time, feeling that her ninja posture was somewhat weak. Delicate. He casually put his chopsticks down and wiped his mouth, casually evaluating, no wonder he has such a petty demeanor. Being petty. Sleeping expressionlessly, he glanced at the spot, tilted his head and let out a grunt, then lowered his head to continue picking at the contents of the bowl. She frowned and fiercely poked at the food, and Quan Na, who looked at it casually and with a hint of anger, also frowned. "Brother, Amin is still in her developmental stage and will grow even longer," he replied in a voice, secretly reaching out and smoothing her back to express comfort. His gaze wandered around his sleeping body, and he added with uncertainty, "It's actually quite good now, at least with good agility or something." He is also not very clear about his appearance during the battle, so it is difficult to make a conclusion. Sleeping usually looks slow and indifferent, which reminds Quan Na of those lazy sheep grazing on the mountain. They have been kept in captivity for a long time, and over time, their reaction to seeing people slows down. Just eating that won't help her develop. Ban put down his chopsticks and casually hugged his chest, leaning against the back of the chair. "You still have something to do later," he said after glancing at Sleepy, who was looking down silently. With a silent sigh, he turned his head and snatched some vegetables from Quanna's bowl, taking a few bites with hatred. She decided to pretend that she couldn't hear the two of them talking. She was still worried about her body size. After all, she was a whole year older than Quanna but almost half a head shorter than Quanna. Quanna sighed silently as she watched her movements, and spoke with a hint of resentment, "Don't blame me. I'm so innocent." "Okay, let me put it another way." Mian scratched her face and glanced at Ban standing next to her holding her chest. Quan Na, who was staring at her intently, let out a silent sigh. She just tried to explain with health, but no one understood. She pondered for a while before speaking again. "If a healthy person's vitality is classified as full, then all I can do is replenish the vitality lost after being attacked." She squatted down and picked a handful of grass from one side of the grass. "And the way I added is to treat myself as a temporary transporter, transferring the vitality contained in plants to humans through touch. This is the main method of use." She turned her head and waved at the spot again. As the person slowly walked over, she scanned him and then reached out to press on the wrist between his sleeve and gloves. "As for another usage. You know, some wounds can cause irreversible damage, reducing the total value of your vitality. In simple terms, it's just a sequela." Her palm felt a slight warmth, and an indescribable gentle force slowly spread through Ban's arm, seemingly only a very small amount of chakra, but it reminded people of the warm spring sun. "And all I can do is repair and build, in simple terms, to cure your sequelae and bring your body back to its peak." The spot moved and suddenly noticed that the scar on the arm gradually faded away, until no trace could be found again. He can feel the same situation happening everywhere in his body. "Although it's not the first time I've learned about her abilities, my first-hand experience can still be stunning." He took a serious look at Sleepy with his head down, and once again, he became determined in his heart to make her work for him. The bundle of grass in Mian's hand slowly withered with the passage of time, and the tender green branches and leaves turned yellow in the blink of an eye. This. She placed her hand in front of Ban and showed him the broken branches and leaves in her hand, then slowly released her finger, and the residue returned to dust with the gentle breeze. It's the cost of treatment. Fill your body with the vitality of other things, that's it. She clapped her hands and was quite satisfied with her explanation. After all, what she said was quite detailed, and even if she were to say anything, she wouldn't be able to say anything. The transfer of life naturally requires an equivalent cost, and nature is fair. Banruo thoughtfully moved his elbow, feeling the transformation of his body. He pondered for a moment and stood still. Kwana took a few steps forward and stood next to Ban. He looked up slightly and asked, "Brother, what do you think?" He is actually a bit uncertain about his brother's thoughts. After all, his ability to sleep can be said to be unprecedented. The cost of chakra is very low, and achieving the conditions looks simple, with outstanding results and no burden on her. These points alone are very prominent in the realm of ninja. If this ability is exposed, the resulting noise can be foreseen. Well, not yet. Ban's thoughts were interrupted by Quan Nai, and his eyes scanned his sleep before casually replying. Before he could rest and settle down, he added slowly. However, Uchiha, you may have to move near us. Chapter 10. Tasks. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Finally, under Quan Nai's persuasion, Mian reluctantly agreed to this request, and her only request was to retain her former residence on the outskirts of the tribe. Due to the fact that many of her family's belongings cannot be transferred, she does not want to destroy the last remnants of her family. Moreover, she has to ask her brother's opinion, so she cannot live on both sides. Ban allowed it without much thought. This requirement can be said to be similar to no, even if she doesn't have specific instructions, no one will move someone else's house without reason. After all, Mian just moved into a new place, and of course, the house still belongs to her. On the spot, Ban discussed the moving time with Mian, and it would be about another winter. After waiting for the weather to be suitable, Mian can temporarily move to the nearest vacant house to the clan leader's house. But it's not like living like this, there's no end to it. They will also quickly build a new home for Mian and her brother in a nearby free place. This matter was raised later by Quan Nai, mostly out of selfishness, but also within reason. So after a little thought, Ban agreed. Quan Na seems very satisfied with this additional condition. Apart from the simple idea of doing something for sleep, there is also the small selfishness of choosing a location very close to his own residence. He fell asleep behind the spot and spat out his tongue, bending his eyes and smiling happily. Like a cute little dog rolling on the ground with food, I couldn't help but bend my eyes even though I was sleeping. So the move was settled like this. Although it's settled, winter is too long for sleep, and if you don't do something, you always feel like it will become dull. So she calmly adjusted for a few more days and resumed her training habits, going to the training ground in her tribe with her brother every day. But in the end, I felt bored again, so I accepted a few more assigned tasks. After all, my younger brother still needs to be raised. The mission I received this time is an escort mission, targeting the nobles of the Fire Kingdom. It can be considered an important task, accompanied by dozens of clan members. The current ninja tribe is very restricted. If ninjas do not accept assignments from the privileged faction, they lack the lifeline of funds and resources. Although ninjas have strong combat capabilities, they are not good at creating resources. So currently, it seems that the lives of these powerful individuals in these countries are much more precious than those of ninjas, even after the establishment of ninja villages in the later stage. The state controls most of the ninjas' mission sources and a large part of their economic resources, and in a sense, it indirectly controls the ninja's lifeline. Well, in the previous world, the ninja profession was considered a highly educated worker. Mianza smacked his lips and roast under his heart. She arrived at the starting point of the mission on time and was surprised by the magnificent carriage and the powerful attendants. She then went to greet all the members of her tribe one by one. Mian and many of the people who went together this time knew each other, and nodding was enough to say hello. Occasionally, a few people who didn't know each other just exchanged their names and gave up. She inquired about the process en route with the client, checked her belongings again, and only then did she look up at Uchiha, who had come down from the carriage, that she realized that this mission had happened to happen. So she looked around for Kwana with a hint of anticipation, only to find that he was not there, and then heard Ban say she had gone to another mission. Sleeping in my heart, I felt a bit regretful, but due to the presence of someone I barely knew, I became more energetic. The journey that requires escort is neither long nor short. According to the ninja's journey, it only takes about 3 to 4 days to reach the destination, and the return journey will take about 7 or 8 days. But with ordinary people, it will slow down and take at least a few weeks. There are more than 10 clan members dispatched this time, which is enough to demonstrate the importance of this powerful figure. She spent a little effort to inquire that this was a diplomat-like official, and this time she was going to the neighboring snow country to continue signing a friendly contract. Now is the first night of the first day of departure, and in the latter half of the night, the ones responsible for guarding the night are Mian and Ban, as well as another tribe member called Huizhua. I leaned against the tree and squinted for a while in the first half of the night, but I still felt a slight drowsiness. She sat up straight and rubbed her eyes, feeling an inexplicable gaze before struggling for a few seconds to open them. Yuji Boban was sitting on the edge of a stone not far from her, looking at her with a complex gaze. He and Mian stared at each other for a few seconds and slightly restrained. But not much. Mianxin said what she was going to do, and after thinking about it, she learned to sit on the ground with her chest hugged like a freckle, with her eyes wide open facing his small eyes. This winter's nights were a bit too cold. Sleeping in a slightly thin Uchiha ethnic uniform, I trembled and rubbed my arms, causing Ban to frown. The warmest thing all over her body was the rabbit fur collar sent by Chuanai covering her shoulders. The soft rabbit fur effectively prevented the cold wind from pouring back into her neck. She buried her face in her fur collar and breathed a few white mist as she opened her mouth. They were not close or far apart, and Ban looked at her with sincerity and seriousness, even able to see her eyelashes shining with water. He naturally realized that the fur collar on his sleeping shoulder came from 2 rabbit fur pieces brought back by his younger brother a while ago. He didn't know for a moment who to be jealous of. Quan Nai didn't give him any handmade products. Mian tilted her face and looked away, as if she had been defeated in this battle. She remained silent, fingering her fingertips, forced to feel the direct and intense gaze from the other side. After feeling the slight pain coming from her fingertips, she couldn't help but ask a low question. "Why are you staring at me?" She couldn't think of anything else to say, so she asked a silly question dryly. After hesitating for a moment, Ban replied, "Don't you like to be watched?" "Then I won't watch." Although he said so, his gaze still lingered on her. He scanned her slightly curled black hair, then turned to her lips that lacked blood color, and finally landed on her slightly red fingertips, her fingers slightly curled, covering her fingertips. "Ah. That's not the case." Mian hesitated for a few seconds after hearing the answer, and answered with uncertainty, "It's not that she doesn't like it, She thought about her wording for a while before continuing, "Maybe it's a bit strange, isn't it?" Her eyes continued to gaze at the snow-covered and opaque ground, trembling her eyelashes as she scanned the surroundings, seeming alert but also indifferent. Her eyes deliberately avoided the spot, as if she was a bit at a loss. "I know." Ban patiently listened to her expression, but his gaze remained on her for a moment, as if he didn't care about others' feelings at all. But Mian felt that his gaze was natural and open, not very likely to provoke resentment. On the contrary, his current somewhat stunned expression appeared to have a strange calmness. The description of peace seems a bit strange when applied to Ban's body. On weekdays, Ban always has a gloomy face, with slightly raised eyes that exude a strong sense of pride. The sweeping gaze makes it difficult for him to catch his breath. The only thing that people in the clan are most afraid of is the young clan leader, who carries too much resentment and can even prick people with subtle fear in front of them. From this perspective, he is somewhat different from Quan Nai, but not completely different. Quan Nai has shown similar behavior on the battlefield, but he always wears a gentle smile when he arrives in front of his tribe, which makes people unconsciously get closer to him. If Banya loves to laugh like Quanah, it's unclear what it looks like, but I always feel it will be very discordant. Mian couldn't help but be lost in thought at this moment, until Ban moved his hand and shook it in front of her before realizing that she had been staring at them for a long time. Isn't this strange? Ban chuckled at her, intentionally mocking the inexplicable words she said. And Mian just buried his face in his fur collar again, silently preparing to ignore him. She wore an awkward blush on her face and tried to hide under her fur collar. She half rested her eyes and stared at the ground carefully, without lifting her head for a long time. After observing the mist emanating from her breathing for a while, Ban felt that she was tired. So he leaned over to sleep without much thought and spoke to her in a low voice. "You can rest first, I'm enough here." With a hint of strange gentleness in his tone, he reached out and draped a coat over her, then sat next to her. He couldn't even express his feelings, he probably only instinctively took off his coat after seeing her trembling a bit pitifully. Well, if it were Chuan, he would do the same. He defended himself a few words in his heart and leaned against her arm with peace of mind. Sleeping for a moment, I gathered my coat and hesitated for a moment, then resentfully classified this action as a caring behavior. She didn't move much, so she tacitly allowed the spot to approach. She felt the warmth of her coat and felt something was wrong, but was too lazy to think back carefully, so she simply ignored this strange feeling. All right, he has already offered his coat. After rushing all day, she was also a bit tired, and when Ban took the initiative to take care of things, she happily accepted them. Okay. She responded casually. Mian still recognizes and trusts Ban's strength, unless he comes to Qianshuzu, there seems to be nothing to worry about. Sleeping on my arm, I calmly buried my face in the plush and rested. She bent her spine, curled up together, and fell asleep in a daze. Winter is really cold, she thought vaguely.